Welcome to our series, The Battle for Public Education in the 21st Century. I'm Ken Yale, education correspondent for Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio.
Yeah, feel this from the bottom of my heart, y'all. Truly inspired. Here we go, come on, look, yo, just teaching to the test. Forced by the feds, or they losing that check. Too many children left behind by this corporate assembly line. How they privatize education is a human right, and their kids gonna be fine. They send them to private schools, while ours get sent to prison or given a job serving fast food.
This is the second of several programs on the history of public education. Today's show is entitled Inequity by Design. In our last program, we explored the ways traditional indigenous peoples viewed the world and educated their youth before European colonizers and settlers arrived in North America. In today's show, we'll look at the very different Eurocentric paradigms that have largely shaped public education in the United States since then. To help us make the bridge from our last program into today's, here is Rose Von Totter-Brand, a Tuscarora woman and the co-founder and director of the Native American Academy.
The very heart of indigenous learning is relationship. Education in the native way is not bounded by a structure or limited by only people that are anointed to teach you within a certain time frame. We learn through relationship, through dream, through ceremony, through song. We learn in community. We learn intergenerationally. But it all really comes down specifically to relationship to place and an understanding of our place in the whole of things. In the indigenous world, human beings are not seen as greater than or lesser than. They are just equal to every other form of life. We belong to the earth. It does not belong to us. What is not taught in the Western education system is that there was a fully functioning, vibrant, rich culture and knowledge flourishing on these lands when they arrived. Because of their cultural lens and their inability to perceive it, they then, through germs, guns, and steel, were able to develop, and out of that development came a hegemonic education system. Now, there's been assault after assault to attempt to break down the sovereignty, and obviously the treaties have been broken many times, to really break apart the culture, to force assimilation. It cannot be done, and it hasn't been done, and ultimately it will not be done. And I think that one of the things that is so difficult for the United States to come to grips with is the truth of our history. You've got to uncover and let the wound be seen, recognized, and healed.
We'll hear more from Rose Von Totter-Brand in later programs, but now we're going to take up her challenge and grapple with the early history of U.S. public education. Our guide is Kevin Kumashiro, Dean of the School of Education at the University of San Francisco and founding director of the Center for Anti-Oppressive Education.
I like to think of the history of public schooling in this country by thinking about where were we drawing from? What were the ideas that we were drawing on as we thought about what schools could look like here in this nation? And so maybe before I talk a little about the United States, I should talk a little bit about Western Europe, which is where a lot of our ideas came from. Industrialization was happening in Western Europe far before it came to the United States or the North American continent. And what we know is that hand in hand with industrialization was also the continuing colonization of Western European powers throughout the world. So when I think about mass schooling or schooling for the masses, I think about what was happening in these countries both abroad and domestically. And so as they were colonizing countries around the world, they needed to create school systems that would help people to self-govern, that would help people to assimilate into a different social and economic and political structure where they were learning to fit towards the bottom of that hierarchy. So mass schooling was in large part a form of socialization for the colonized. And what we see is that parallel to what we're building in other nations abroad what was happening domestically. So as these nations were also going through industrialization, hand in hand with industrialization is often urbanization and the growth of large cities, moving around of people from space to space, which means suddenly we now have these large populations, many newcomers to the area who have to learn how to fit in. So mass schooling, even domestically within these Western European countries, was about socialization, was about teaching the masses to fit into a particular structure of society. What I think is interesting is then to think about the emergence of public education here in this country. And we often think about public education as all about equal educational opportunity and preparing all students to succeed and all of that, leveling the playing field. But the reality is that public education in this country, its predecessor is known as common schools. And common schools emerged in the late 1700s. It was really thriving as a movement until around the Civil War. So for almost a century, we had this thing called common schools, which is kind of this mixture of public and private. And it tended to be one-room schoolhouses. It tended to be very small schools that were serving some of the more elite in this nation, right? Before the advent of common schools, how were we teaching children? Well, we were teaching them through tutors that maybe wealthier families were bringing in. Different groups of people were giving different education to their children, right? Boys were getting different education from girls. White children were getting different education from children of color, and so on. Well, the common schools was therefore for the more elite. It tended to be boys from white American families and families that owned property. And what we see in the common school era was that even way back then, academics were not the only thing that was the purpose of schooling. Academics went hand in hand with moral education and socialization, right? The most common reader at the time, for decades really, was called the Mcguffie Reader, which was teaching students to read by using really this kind of fire and brimstone Protestant stories about how, you need to kind of follow the teachings of the church or you'll perish in hell kind of thing. So it was very hard, even way back then, to separate academics from moral education. And so that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. Socialization has always been a goal of education, whether we're talking about the masses or the elite. But then what we see in the late 1800s, early 1900s was a major shift, because at this time in this nation, we were going through our own industrial revolution. And coinciding with industrialization was the growth of large cities. So industrialization went hand in hand with urbanization, which also went hand in hand with immigration. Large groups of people were immigrating from particularly European nations at the same time that we were building these larger and larger cities. So all of a sudden now, we were at this place where we were asking ourselves, well, how do we kind of control this large population, many of them newcomers to this country? And so it's not surprising that this was the time when we saw large public urban systems begin to develop, particularly in metropolitan areas in this country. And what's interesting is that the schools that we developed now for the masses looked really quite different than the schools that we were developing a century earlier for the more elite. The schools for the masses began to really mirror a lot of the elements that we saw in factories. So we began to divide students much more. We divided them by age. We divided them by, and many times, gender. And we also began to compartmentalize the work that they were doing, just as we see in factories. So we began to divide by subjects and divide by time and so on. And it's also the case that the curriculum became less about kind of thinking and reading and writing and expression and creativity. It became much more about rote memorization, much more a curriculum that really taught you to follow rather than taught you to lead. And this is the beginning of public education, right? So we could say, yes, public education began for the most elite, and as we were forced to integrate more and more people, we came up with more and more ways to sort students. I like to make the argument that although we often say the purpose of education is around helping everyone to succeed, leveling the playing field, equal educational opportunity, the function of schools has always been to sort and differentiate. We just came up with more and more indirect ways to accomplish that.
We'll come back to Kevin Kumashiro in a moment, but as we think about his description of a public education system designed to sort and differentiate based on race, class, gender, and nationality, let's hold the indigenous view present in our minds. Check out these words from George Galvis, the director of Communities United for Restorative Youth Justice.
In 1492, we had a clash between two irreconcilable worldviews. One that's manifested today by the concept of maximize profits, minimize expenditures, where we value money before people, but at that time was manifested by what I refer to as the 3 Gs, greed, gold, and genocide. And our indigenous worldview, which is reflected in many different ways across indigenous cultures across the globe, but we say in the Lakota language, mitaki asen, all my relations. In the Mayan language, we say, In Lakesh, you are my other self, or in Spanish, tú eres mi otro yo. I'm a reflection of you, you're a reflection of me. We are interconnected. Every young person, that's the first teaching they need to have, is a sense of connection.
Now back to Kevin Kumashiro, Dean of the School of Education at the University of San Francisco. I asked him to say more about who has been included in the public education system historically and who has not.
Yeah, that's such a great question. You know, when common schools were created, one of the ideas was that we should teach everyone a common curriculum. The ideal was also that it would be free. But free for whom is really the important question, right? And obviously it was not meant for the peasants. It was not meant for the day laborers. It was not meant for enslaved peoples. And it was not even meant for girls in many instances. So we began to broaden who we think schools were for. But even when we agreed that different groups of students, particularly those from the margins of society, should be allowed into schools, we began to create separate schools. So in the 1800s, what we saw was many separate schools being created for girls, separate schools being created for people of darker skin. And certainly by the late 1800s, we were seeing really a burgeoning of schools for different groups of people. And a really great example would be the burgeoning of boarding schools for American Indian students, right? That really proliferated all throughout the country in the late 1800s and early 1900s, as well as even for immigrant populations. I can think of schools that were created for Asian immigrant students in Hawaii, which is where I grew up. And in both the schools for the Asian immigrant students, as well as the schools, the American Indian boarding schools, what we see here is a very explicit goal of Americanization. The major goal here was to teach students where they fit into the structures of this society. And in fact, one of the kind of unofficial mottos or mantras of the American Indian boarding schools was to, quote, kill the Indian, save the man, right? It was about losing parts of yourself that we devalue as a nation so that you can fit into a particular space that we're creating for you in this nation. And you could argue that throughout education, even as we began to incorporate more and more people, the curriculum was still one that differentiated, right? So there are many ways to sort. We can sort through separate schools. We can sort through separate classrooms as we do through tracking, but we can also sort ideologically through the curriculum and what we teach and how we then expect you to participate in the society.
Let's leave the history here for today and reflect on what we've heard as we listen again to George Galbis. He is speaking to educators and community activists at an Oakland summit about the school-to-prison pipeline.
And I kind of want to take a moment to just dispel this myth of the failure of public schools, the failure of policing and confinement to achieve public safety and justice, and just say that failure is by design. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing.
Absolutely.
So let's just talk a moment about the origins of what the first prisons were. The first prisons were the slave plantation and the reservation. The first police were the slave catchers and the cavalry.
That's right.
So I feel like we need to place it in its proper social historical context to know exactly what it is that we're dealing with. And boarding schools and education weren't about empowerment. They were about miseducation and indoctrination.
That's right.
So how we now, in our roles as educators and community workers, are attempting to shift that culture within a system that by design was to help maintain social control in our oppression, I think is the challenge.
Our guests today have challenged us to honestly face our history. That's especially important for all of us who want a more socially just educational system, because how we name and contextualize a problem impacts how we choose to solve it. The problems in education are not just rooted in individual attitudes or practices. How many of us knew that by the 1830s, most southern states had laws that forbid teaching slaves how to read, or that in 1852, 2 years after California became a state, the legislature passed a bill barring African American children from schools, or that in 1864, the U.S. Congress made it illegal for indigenous peoples to be taught in their native languages. How is this still resonating in today's laws that prevent the children of undocumented immigrants from attending public schools, or in the attacks on bilingual education and ethnic studies? Connecting the dots between the past and the present shines a light on the inequities that have been deeply rooted in the design, structure, and fabric of public education. That inequity, while it has changed forms over the centuries, is still solidly ingrained at the foundation of our educational system today. On our next